Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online. Thank you for being here with us now. For the next 2 hours or so, we will have the great honor to listen to 3 prominent researchers discussing language and literacy development, global and local issues. So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Kenneth Pugh from Haskins Laboratories and Yale University, Professor Arturo Hernandez from the University of Houston, and Professor Augusto Buchweitz from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate in this panel and to share your research on language and literacy with us. As you know, Abralim ao Vivo Linguists Online is a virtual event beautifully put together by Miguel and his team in the Brazilian Linguistics Association. And this is done in cooperation with CIPL, the Permanent International Committee of Linguistics, and various other associations in the language sciences, including the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentine Society of Linguistic Studies, the Spanish Society of Linguistics, the Linguistics Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistics Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics, to mention some of the associations collaborating in this project. Language and literacy development are interconnected in many complex ways. This connection can be approached from different perspectives, and in this session, we will approach it from a neurocognitive perspective, covering various aspects of this relationship, including the brain bases of learning to read, bilingualism, and the vectors of early literacy. The neurocognitive approach is complementary to other approaches that have been or will be presented in other sessions in this event. I am Mailce Mota from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil, and I'd like to thank Miguel, the president of Abralim, for inviting me to organize this panel session. So here's how the session will work. Professor Augusto Buchweitz and I will moderate the session. Professor Kenneth Pugh will start, followed by Professor Hernandez, and then Professor Augusto Buchweitz will present his talk. After the 3 talks, they will then address your questions and comments. So please, as they present, do post your questions and comments on the chat. If you want your question or comment to be addressed by one of them, please indicate so when you pose the question. So now I would like to invite Augusto to introduce Professor Kenneth Pugh.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, can.
Okay.
Let me just briefly introduce you. Thank you, Mailce, and thank you to Abralim and all of the organizing committee and the people working to make this happen. It's such a difficult time. It is my pleasure to be a part of this webinar and to introduce Kenneth Pugh, who is the Director of Research at Haskins Laboratories, one of the most renowned laboratories around the world in research on spoken and written language. Dr. Pugh is Associate Professor in Department of Linguistics at Yale, Department of Diagnostic Radiology at Yale School of Medicine, Psychology at University of Connecticut, and his research and his long-standing publications in dyslexia, reading, and learning to read focus on the neurobiology of typical and atypical language and reading development in children. Ken, it is my pleasure to give you the floor, and we're all lucky to have you here. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Augusto and Mailce. Let me make sure that my slides can be seen. How does that look? Okay, and let me move all the pictures out of the, there we go. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Mailce and Augusto and Miguel and all the others for inviting me to this amazing event, this virtual event. It's a pleasure to be here. I've collaborated in recent years with Augusto and a longtime friend of Arturo Hernandez. And so this feels like a kind of a coming home ceremony. What I'm going to talk about in my first, in this presentation is what we know about the bi-directional relationship between oral language and written language. The ways in which not only is written language or reading and writing dependent on the quality of the neural systems that support speech, perception, and production, but also how learning to read actually changes and can change those systems that we have specialized for oral language. As Augusto said, I'm the president and director of research at Haskins Laboratories, and I know there are many linguists in this meeting today. Haskins is an interdisciplinary international institute. We're formally affiliated with both Yale University and University of Connecticut, but also with 30 US universities and 25 universities around the world. And the reason for the collaborations globally, of course, is that we study language and we care deeply about what is invariant across world languages and what might be idiosyncratic to one or another. Historically, the lab began its history, and I just need to make sure I know how to move this mouse. The lab historically has focused on really deeply understanding the biology of human communication in all its form. But for those of you who study speech and perception and production, you probably know a bit about the history of technology and research on the mechanisms of how humans produce and perceive speech and the relevant disorders. So because we're a lab that started out in 1935 as a really focused on the biology of language, almost exclusively in the area of oral language, speech, it was not until somewhere about 30 or 40 years in to the Institute's ongoing work on things like categorical perception and the nature of the vocal tract and how we can understand perception action dependencies in human speech, and some work on syntax and comprehension. It wasn't until some years into the history of the laboratory, again, being a speech laboratory, being a community of linguists, psychologists, neuroscientists, communication disorder specialists, that we began to ask questions: what is written language and why is it so hard for so many? When in some sort of obvious and maybe superficial sense, we can say that we are wired to talk and listen, but we're not wired to read and write. So again, let me start with the preliminaries. Speech is a biological specialization. And for those of us who do brain research, either neuroimaging, as I do, and some of the others here, or neuropsychology and patient studies, there's a fair understanding of the ways in which the brain has specialized itself to talk and listen. And speech is mastered naturally in almost all people, save those children with profound SSD, speech and language disorders. But it's mastered without direct instruction, if you will. Reading, on the other hand, the written form is difficult for many, and reading failure occurs in large numbers of children across all written languages. And as you know, reading is a relatively recent cultural invention, cognitive invention in some sense. a way of representing natural language by a new mode. And the brain, in some basic way, as Stan DeHaan likes to say, is not wired to talk, to read and write, but rather needs to exercise in something we can call neuroplasticity, or DeHaan calls neuronal recycling, to take tissue and pathways that have evolved for vision and language, for associative learning, for attentional control, and turn them in to a biologic system that can allow the child learning to read to get from vision into language very fast. Because as you know, if you are reading, if you're going to become an adequate reader, you need to be able to decode words very fast, on the order of a couple hundred milliseconds. And if you're not able to do that, reading becomes very labored, error prone, and of course it impacts in a kind of a bottom-up way comprehension. So building circuits that allow the child to become fluent is the business of learning to read, and good instruction is essential. And I will point in my talk and make this claim rather strongly, that even though languages like Spanish and Portuguese and English and Finnish and others differ in the degree of their transparency between the written and spoken form, between orthography and phonology, there are, we believe, universals, even in languages that on the surface can be thought of as easier to learn to read, such as Spanish or Portuguese. There is no brain specialization for reading. Reading is, in some sense, an exercise in neuronal recycling. Well, at Haskins Laboratories, as I mentioned at the outset, we have a long history of caring a lot about the machinery and the biology and the brain and physiologic basis of how people produce and perceive speech. For those, one of the old golden oldies of the work of my mentor, Alvin Liberman, and others, was an appreciation that somehow perception of language makes contact. It depends upon, in some way, the ways in which language is produced. And of course, that has come to be known as the motor theory. Researchers at Haskins in the 80s, led by Ram Frost and Shlomo Benton and Len Cates, began the first research across many written languages on skilled readers and what they do well, which is get from I to meaning bloody fast and decode fast. And they began to codify world languages in terms of the degrees to which the orthography-phonology relations are either one-to-one or one-to-many. English being a fairly irregular language, Spanish being a fairly regular, well, a largely regular language. Research also began to focus not on just how skilled readers leverage this oral language systems in reading, but what goes wrong in children who struggle inordinately with reading, whether due to congenital, environmental, or combinations of reasons. And this especially pointed to an early intuition that I think is not always fully appreciated, though it's widely known. And that is that the best predictor of whether children will struggle with becoming fluent automatic readers is really more likely to be found in their phonological processing skills, and certainly not in their visual ones. So for the vast majority of children who present with difficulties in reading, the problems are either language or connecting language to vision in some basic sense. And of course, as I'm here to talk about today, we always have been committed to the notion that we might be able to gain insight. Let me say this clearly and carefully, that brain imaging or mapping into the wetware is not good because it's cool, because it's exciting to see pretty brain pictures. There can be a lot of silly work and rather uninteresting work when people have big machines and no theories. Our understanding has always been this, that if somehow understanding the biologic pathways can give us special and deep insights into individual variation, individual differences, to understand how variation in connections in the brain relate to complex phenotypes in language and reading, then that's a kind of value added, an insight into mechanism. And I want to unpack, as I go through my presentation, some of the evidence that I think suggests that brain imaging, even for a linguist or psychologist or a mathematical psychologist or a computational modeler, can have value added because it has exquisite sensitivity to individual differences that underlie behavior. So basically, let's remember that learning to read is learning to get from I to meaning very fast, and building this triangle. When a child comes into the literate environment, and if they've been in an adequate oral language preschool world, with lots of language stimulation, they will know many thousands of words in terms of their phonologic forms and their meanings. But of course, at that point, they know nothing about the other side of this emerging triangle, namely the graphemes or the syllables or the aksharas or any other unit that's used to represent radicals, used to represent the phonology. But somehow over the course of a few years, the child who's given adequate instruction needs to create a very deep binding in which orthography, phonology, and semantics become so tightly bi-directionally connected that when information passes through the visual system into the orthographic system, it is almost instantaneously having availability of the phonologic form and the rich and complex syntax and semantics, morpho syntax, etc. So what is the brain basis of this? What do we know from modern imaging about how the brain does this? Well, in some obvious sense, as you most of you I'm sure know, there is a lot of specialization, as I said at the beginning, for speaking and listening. Posterior regions, Wernicke's area, if damaged, was more likely to produce receptive difficulties than expressive ones. Anterior, inferior motor areas, Broca's area, for example, has a reverse profile. In a normal speaking and listening human being, these motor perceptual systems along left perisylvian cortex, but also in the right and in other areas, but especially in left perisylvian cortex, will develop a kind of an instantaneous feed forward and feedback organization, and that allows the child to walk and talk and communicate. But of course, in learning to read, there has to be some reorganization of cortex and subcortical systems to allow visual information that enters in the occipital lobe to find fast pathways that allow you to do this thing I mentioned at the beginning, which is to be able to decode so efficiently and effortlessly that the attention of the reader can go to higher order aspects of the message. There are parietal areas, including the angular gyrus, that our research, as well as lesion research, suggests are important in this mapping, but there are also areas in the ventral occipitotemporal cortex that you'll see in the literature emerge with early experience across all languages studied to date and take on a very important role in mapping quickly and efficiently from I to language, if you will. Some of the methods we use, and I'm not going to go into them in this short presentation, but we use functional imaging that it measures either blood flow changes such as MRI, fMRI, and PET, or measures electro or magneto physiologic activity such as ERP and MEG. For those of you not in the field, you should know that the functional imaging, the hemodynamic imaging, gives beautiful information on location, but no real useful information on the timing. EEG has a sort of an opposite profile. It won't surprise any of you who are not in this playing in this field that we now try to combine these modalities in order to get the spatiotemporal characteristics of language and reading. So when we look using fMRI at a typical English adult skilled reading sample, this is a group average, in a task where the subject is doing something very simple. They're either reading or listening to a list of words, and they simply make a judgment in order to make sure they're processing the word of whether the word is a living thing and they press one button, or an object and they press another. And as you can see in red along the perisylvian cortex, so near to the primary and secondary auditory cortex, are areas designated by this statistical analysis in red that respond uniquely to what? To the spoken form. No surprise. This is the auditory cortex. And in the visual cortex in yellow are voxels, are parts of the brain, voxels being computer three-dimensional pixels, that respond uniquely to which mode? Well, of course, vision. If it doesn't work like that and the primary areas don't behave the way they should, we might as well all go into another business. However, what's interesting about skilled readers, as you can see here in green, are that lots of important tissue like Wernicke's area, the angular gyrus, supramarginal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus around the perisylvian regions are showing up in this analysis in green. And all that means in simple terms is this: those neural systems, those hubs in a skilled reader no longer care whether the stimulus comes to eye or ear. They become amodal or integrated or convergent. And this is sort of what happens when a brain solves the puzzle of connecting the written and spoken form. A lot of areas that are part of the natural specialization, like Wernicke's and Broca's, for speaking, become available to the reader as part of the development of rapid reading ability. So without going too deep into the weeds, but we're happy to share details of this for those who are interested in many papers. In the left hemisphere, there are a number of hubs that seem to emerge across most languages, including anterior ones in the inferior frontal, parieto-temporal, and as I mentioned, this ventral occipito-temporal region that's come to be referred to as a word form system. And as our work and others have shown, and is shown in this figure, that as readers go from being accurate at the beginning, knowing how to build that triangle, orthography, phonology, semantics, to becoming fluent and automatic, what happens is there is a development of function in this left fast mapping system in ventral cortex that comes to support fluent and automatic decoding. So there's a distributed set of regions that are involved in learning, particularly parieto-temporal and frontal, as well as attention and subcortical regions, including the pulvinar nucleus and the basal ganglia. But ultimately, as reading becomes more easy, more automatic, as that triangle becomes instantiated in the brain, there is increasing specialization for this ventral pathway. As I said, we care a lot, though, not just about how learning to read might depend on speech, but also how learning to read might change speech. And I always love to bring this kind of slide into a talk with language specialists, because it's really fascinating how the written language changes in some important ways the oral. And so, for example, research on structure published by a colleague of ours, Manolo Carreras at the BCBL and with colleagues at the Wellcome Center in England, showed that literate adults have more gray matter volume in some of those parieto-temporal areas that are close to the speech machinery, but clearly become involved in reading, but they end up changing some of the organization for speech. In a very, very sort of provocative study by Stan DeHaan, they took illiterate adults who differed in the degree to which the perisylvian regions activate for print, unsurprisingly, since they didn't know how to read. and found that as they taught reading, they changed the signal, the response to auditory spoken content in the auditory cortex, in secondary, tertiary cortex, as a function of having learned to read. The way in which speech is being processed is changed. There's a very famous study by Castros Caldas and others showing that illiterate adults are not as good at shadowing and repeating complex pseudo word utterances than literate ones. So what I want you to take from this, very briefly, is that learning to read can change speech. But as our work shows, it also depends on it. So we've had this longstanding hypothesis that essentially claims that becoming a fluent reader depends on being able to make this transformation of the perisylvian cortex. And as one of our linguists at Haskins wrote some years ago, reading is in some sense parasitic on oral language, on speech. So very quickly, let me just go through a few studies that illustrate this. This is a study we did as part of a large longitudinal project. The children were 7 years old when they entered the study, and they ranged in large numbers from those who seemed to be developing written language well and those who were falling behind. And when you look at this brain image, this axial slice, the left hemisphere is on the right side. It's as if you're looking up from the bottom. And what you can see is in the superior temporal gyrus here, we find a very interesting effect in 7-year-old emergent readers. Children who have good phonological skills and they have that readiness for reading, they activate the speech area for spoken words, unsurprisingly, but they also activate this region for written words. Children who are struggling with language and phonologic skills early on activate this region for speech because that's what God intended it for. It is, after all, speech cortex. But they show no engagement of these speech areas if they are struggling with phonological and phonological awareness deficits. So this establishes somehow, maybe in an obvious way if you're a neurolinguist, but it establishes pretty clearly that in emergent readers, somehow being more linguistically malleable means that the tissue that has been wired by evolution for talking and listening becomes available for print. And I wouldn't be boring you with this and fussing with it unless it really turns out to be developmentally important. So in a study we published from that same sample, but tracked those children for 2 years, when they were in school, in 3rd grade, we were predicting their reading from the way in which their brain processed stimuli, spoken and written, in 1st grade. So what does that pattern in 1st grade that I just showed you predict about reading outcomes? And so we looked at the brain in the 7-year-old. We identified areas that are unique to print and speech and these kind of connective convergence zones that are just emerging at 7, shown in red in this slide. And what we found is that when we try to predict reading in 3rd grade, even controlling for using behavioral tests, we find that the best predictor of reading in 3rd grade is not what the brain looks like only when it reads or listens, but actually whether it uses that same tissue to do both jobs. In other words, those things that I was showing earlier as green. This is very important. This suggests in this slide here that we can account for a lot of variance in 3rd grade reading scores on both word and comprehension tests as a function of the degree to which the oral and written language systems have become properly integrated in a young age. So is this unique to English with its strange orthography, or is it the same in other languages? To illustrate quickly, a paper we published in PNAS a few years ago with colleagues in China and in Israel and in Spain, and of course at Haskins Laboratories at Yale, I looked at this signature of skilled reading, and the short take home is in this study, we found no differences between the ways in which the perisylvian system reorganizes for this integration, even in non-alphabetic languages like Chinese, and no difference between regular Spanish and irregular English. So what appears to be evident here is that these processes whereby print and oral language become so intimate are invariant and universal. And we, of course, have other data to this effect. Now, showing these differences are there is important. But of course, having the same pathways doesn't always imply that the languages are read precisely the same, that the same computations are occurring. But they do suggest that at the level of what the emergent reader needs to get, there is a kind of universality. There is a kind of need for the brain to reshape its speech connections in order to read well. And of course, on a practical level, and I won't spend much time on that in this talk, that would really reinforce what a lot of work on behavioral interventions in reading suggests, which is that we must reinforce language skills early on in order to promote better reading. We have to promote these connections. Last couple of things, if Mailce, do I have a couple of minutes?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so very quickly, another area that we find very important is what does skilled reading depend on in a very young brain? And so I will just say this, I don't have time in these opening remarks to unpack this, but there is very strong evidence from very early ages that the quality of the development of perception production systems in spoken language and the richness of oral language experience are super important for whether the child will transition to literacy well or will struggle with it. Just to illustrate quickly with a study of ours, because we all like to show our own, in a study we published in Brain, we were again tracking children in a longitudinal study, but in this case, we looked back at their early history and we measured something called late onset of talking or late talking. And there has been a lot of behavioral studies suggesting that delays in oral language development in ages 1 to 3 can actually have a predictive negative impact on literacy. And so we replicated that finding, but we also measured it in the brain. And what we found in the brain is that in children, even as they enter school, who have a history of early language delays, of course, not all children who struggle with reading have language issues early on, and not all children with early language will struggle with reading, but there is a statistical relation. And we found an important neurological one in the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the superior temporal gyrus. So what do I want you to get from that? Because we're running low on time. That there's a lot of research. This is just one silly, simple illustration of how the developing brain from when language first emerges in infancy is shaping and preparing for literacy. If I have 1 or 2 more minutes, I'll just introduce the issue of reading disability, but then I'll cut short. So of course, given what I've said about written language and spoken language and how they depend on one another, it's probably not surprising that, as I said earlier, children who struggle with reading usually struggle with building the connections between orthography and phonology, this base of the triangle shown in this figure. And those are further predicted by early difficulties in processing and operating on phonologic units. This is well known and it's universal. And what ends up happening in the brain is that these connections that I talked about, these developmental shifts toward the ventral pathway, these print speech binding effects are delayed and are disrupted. And children in general, for example, in this paper shown by Iraldo Palasu, in 3 languages, dyslexic readers, struggling readers, in French, English, and Italian, there were no differences in the neural signature. There was a failure to develop these fast pathways, this so-called occipitotemporal pathway. Now, I want to end on a couple of just quick notes for you, and I won't unpack this with data, except one slide. What we know so far is summarized in this slide, that typical versus atypical reading in the brain looks different. How could it not? Of course, you struggle in the reading, it's in the brain. And so knowing that the brain looks different in dyslexia is not an explanation. It's not good enough to say, well, the brain isn't exactly functioning the same way. It must be different. And so nobody is claiming, I'm not claiming, that knowing that the brain looks different and doesn't make the same connections in dyslexia is a causal explanation. No. But here's what you can get. You can get 2 things. One, you can get guidance on which pathways are most fragile. And then using intervention studies, which we now do quite a few of, as shown here, you can ask whether different approaches are capable of impacting those poorly connected pathways. If you're on the right track in intervention, you should be not just getting some preliminary gains, but you should be impacting the atypicality. So knowing how the brain is different provides a biomarker for treatment. And there's a good deal of work going on in my lab and many others that looks at treatment. And then the last piece is beyond treatment, it also provides an open question for a deeper neuroscience. And this is where I will end. If we know that the typically developing brain is different in the way it organizes circuits, it opens a question, why? And as we dive deeply into genes and structure and neurochemistry and functional organization, as we're currently doing in a project with a colleague, Fumiko Heft and I, where we dive deeply into how genes and chemicals and structural development converge on producing atypical reading. So what I want to end with is this. Knowing how the brain differs in struggling readers, knowing that good reading depends on speech, those are important things. They're not good enough. They're not definitive, but they open up the doorway for studies of treatment and for a deeper neuroscience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ken, so much for your presentation, your enlightening presentation. We will keep the questions for
Thank you, Augusto.
No, we have to thank you. And I'll let Mailce introduce Dr. Arturo Hernandez.
Okay, thank you, Augusto. I just want to remind the audience that the questions will be taken at the end of the 3 talks. So I'd like to introduce Professor Arturo Hernandez. It's a great honor to introduce you, Professor. So Professor Hernandez is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Houston, where he's also director of the Laboratory for the Neural Basis of Bilingualism. Professor Hernandez investigates the brain basis of bilingual language processing using behavioral and neuroimaging methods. His work focuses on 3 main aspects of bilingualism: the age at which a language is learned, the role of proficiency, and the cognitive control mechanisms involved in maintaining 2 languages. His thoughts on the nature of language learning and processing are in line with contemporary views of emergentism, more specifically neurocomputational emergentism, which he will address in his talk now. So Professor Hernandez, thank you very much again for being with us today.
Arturo, can people hear Arturo? I cannot.
I think you need to unmute.
Oh, I have to unmute that. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
No, Arturo does.
Okay, very good. Okay, sorry. Let me go back here. So I had said thank you, obrigado, but I'm going to give my my talk in English. It's a little easier for me. So the bilingual brain really lines up across 3 different dimensions, and actually this is work was really from neuropsychology from over 100 years ago. 3 basic premises. One is that earlier acquisition is later than later acquisition, that it depends on how well you speak a language, and the third is that there's a cognitive control component. And the idea in the neuropsychology literature was that depending on when you acquired the language, how well you spoke it, or perhaps damage to a control mechanism, you would lose access to that language. And so what would happen is neuropsychological patients would have language loss. And bilingualism became this area where people ask these types of questions about the 2 languages. So, and these are the sort of pioneers of this area, really, from, you know, Ribot around the 1890s when he did his work, Petrie's not shortly thereafter, and Putzel a little bit later in the 1920s. So the idea is that a lot of people talk about in the bilingual literature as, you know, this new idea of cognitive control and bilingualism really is almost 100 years old. And so a lot of times I like to remind people, you know, a lot of the ideas that people kind of float out as these new, you know, broadly impressive ideas, and you'll see many studies, and sometimes the technology is new, the question is fairly old. And so I think we can reflect on that and think about it. So what's the new wrinkle I will give you today on these old ideas? The new wrinkle I will sort of talk about is this difference between what I call sensorimotor plasticity and cognitive flexibility, right? And by sensorimotor plasticity, so this is, again, a study done by Ping Li, not in our lab, where what they wanted to model was the acquisition of the vocabulary of 2 languages, either when there was early second language learning, right? So this is a Chinese English, very early learner of a second language, or late second language learning. And what you can see in these slides is that there's this kind of big island of Chinese and of English that are kind of independent when you have very early learning, but when it's late learning, you get this Chinese kind of being intermixed in between, right? So that there's sort of this parasitic kind of relationship between the 2 languages. More recently, Peñalosa and colleagues have been doing work kind of extending this type of model, right, to look at what Ken nicely produced, right, this idea of there's no orthography here, but there is a semantic map, an English phonetic map, and a Spanish phonetic map. And the idea they wanted to look at, or what they were testing, was to look at age of acquisition, right? So you can get here these kind of nice color-coded versions of their maps, right? From semantic to English to Spanish, and then these interconnections between the 2 lexica as well. And so you can kind of see in the semantic maps here, right, that there are differences between fruit and vegetables. So I've kind of honed in here on differences, you know, so you can see sprouts or snow peas, apple and pear on one other side. So these are semantic maps. And then you can see the phonetic map. So in this case, this is the English phonetic map, and you can see that there are some differences between these phonological representations. And what they found was when they looked at the way that people acquired, right? So these are, again, the different phonetic maps. When they were early learners, right, that had very high, or a network, again, these aren't people, right? You could get this sort of organization that looks pretty clean, right? But when it was late and high, then the representation kind of breaks down such that you see a lot more fuzziness in this representation. So again, the idea they have is that, right, the representation is affected by when that language is learned. And we find the same thing when we look. So this is a very simple task done by a former student, Pilar Achila Suerte, who looked at people who were just basically listening to phonological contrasts in English. And what you can see is that there's a difference between those that are proficient, right, higher proficiency, higher and low, right, in the superior temporal gyrus and Rolandic operculum, right, a parietal lobe area, a temporal lobe area, generally involved in speech, although as Ken just mentioned, obviously may have something to do with literacy or may be stimulated by literacy and literates. And also differences between late and early bilinguals, right, in other areas. And so the idea here is that all of these types of experiences, whether one acquires a language early or late in life, whether one is more proficient or not, affects how the brain codes this information. So I'll take a second aside here for a second, because this is a sort of a little bit independent of the flexibility argument, but it's something that kind of came to my mind that I really wanted people to pay attention to when they read these neuroimaging studies. And there's been a lot of discussion in various labs about power, right? So there's a sort of replicability crisis that, what data is really valid? Can we make sense of this? And I want to bring this back to a study that we did when we looked at structural MRI, so structural images of the brain. And we looked at a group of monolinguals, early, late, and all, and as you can see, all bilinguals here. So pretty large groups, relatively speaking, for an MRI study, but this was collected over many, many, many years. We have some of the sort of data on them. So for example, the English proficiency in the monolingual English speakers is higher than in the bilinguals. But then of course, if we look at the Spanish proficiency, we've actually measured that in this study, in some studies, and it's definitely much lower in the monolinguals, although monolinguals in Texas will know some words in Spanish, enough to get a score higher than 0, but not much. So what we did in this study was to randomly sample the samples or the size of our clusters. So we compared monolinguals and bilinguals, and we looked at a true positive, that is an effect that to us, right, what is our true positive rate? Can we detect a difference that's really there? And you might say, how do we know what the true positive was? Well, we actually had this very large sample of monolinguals and bilinguals. So in this first study that I'm presenting here, we looked at all bilinguals versus all monolinguals. So it's a very large sample, and we found one difference. So we know we can kind of play God, if you will. We can actually tell what the difference is. There are a lot of false negatives. That's not unusual. We just don't get a difference, right? But we know there is one there, but we can't capture it. So notice that most of the time when we do these simulations, so we're basically taking a bunch of groups of 20 that are different groups, taken out of the larger groups over and over and over again. And you can see our true positive and our true negative doesn't differ until we get to about 140. So I just thought this was a really important methodological point. A lot of studies in the bilingual imaging literature tend to be in this range, right? So they think a really good sample size is 50. As you notice, it's really not till we get to 70 that we can really tell the difference between a true positive and a false positive. So that's kind of scary. And I think I'll bring back that point in a second on a study that we actually published. And this is just looking at the effect size. So it turns out if you have very small samples, you actually get bigger effects than if you have larger samples, which is another scary thing. So the larger our samples, the closer our measurement gets to what reality is, right? The smaller our sample, it's much more inflated, but it also, as I noted here, it can be a false positive, right? So we actually get inflation of effects that are not true of the larger group. We also took this larger one, and I'll go back to a more conceptual idea about age of acquisition. When Hannah Clausenius-Kalman did a study where she aggregated the same group of early and late bilinguals to look at the difference in structural brain. This case, it was a cortical thickness that she used. But in summarizing the literature that had been published up until the time, looking at effects of early versus late, sequential versus simultaneous, people who learned one language and then a second, or those who learned both simultaneously, what she found was that when you look at all of the different studies, you really don't get an area of difference neuroanatomically or structurally that differs between early and late learners. You can see they're all areas that you would expect. but the studies don't really match up, and they don't match even on the different measures they use. Some of them use density, some of them use volume, some of them use thickness. So you can see all the different measures they use, and you get a lot of some perisylvian area, right? What looks like, I guess, maybe a motor area near the mouth, middle frontal gyrus, some posterior areas, parietal areas, and areas in the temporal lobe. So pretty much a lot of different areas. A lot of language areas and some non-language areas. When she actually did her study, so she actually used 4 or 3 different measures, and I think it was 2 different programs. So she used SPM and FreeSurfer to look at the same 2 groups of early and late bilinguals. And what she found essentially was a replication of the literature. So her data on this large group replicates all these different findings. And again, I think this is a warning for us to try to make conclusions about data. Is a lot of times people find an effect that they run in one particular study here, let's say, for example, and they write a paper about it. And again, I don't think anyone writes the paper saying that this is the only area that differs. But when we look at larger groups, we can see that the situation is much more complicated. So age of acquisition has an effect, but the effect is actually quite large, and it appears in many different areas, and we can only see it, right, and depending on the metric in certain areas. And so again, this is just kind of like a warning about science, is that, you know, when we find something, we have to realize that we're only kind of peeking at a small difference that may be there. There may be other differences that we're not picking up. And so I think this is just a nice sort of eye-opener. And when she actually showed me these 2 figures, I almost fell over, because it's like, she's fine. I mean, like, for example, this little green spot here, that looks like one of the studies. Again, you know, with a different measure, but again, we were able to detect that difference. In more sort of smaller studies, looking at the idea of children, bilingual children who speak both languages, these are, again, more traditional types of sizes in the 20s, as I mentioned. Our studies also do that, because you can't always get, 70 bilingual kids in 2 different groups, because these groups, one of them are balanced bilinguals, so that their proficiency is very similar in both languages. And the second group is one that has lower proficiency in English, right? So their Spanish proficiency is just as good as the balanced group, but the English proficiency differs between the balanced and unbalanced. And what you find structurally, which is really interesting, is that the unbalanced group, right? So if we look at if we look at the thickness, right? The balanced group shows reduced thickness in these areas here, right? Here and here. So there seems to be something about the acquisition of these 2 languages that is associated with, again, we can't establish causality, between these thickness in these areas and whether they're balanced or unbalanced, which is an interesting sort of observation. The other thing that Pilar Archila-Suerte observed in this study was that the balanced bilinguals showed larger volume in the putamen, right? And this is kind of an interesting point, because the putamen, there's a lot of discussion about what the putamen is or what it does, what's it involved in. We call it a motor control area. Some people call it a cognitive control area, but again, it seems to be involved in you might categorize it as sort of phonological motor control to some extent. And so it's an interesting question of exactly why we found this, but it's surprising that we would get something in an area that's subcortical, right? Suggesting there's some kind of subcortical involvement in differentiating between balanced and unbalanced bilinguals. So that's the section, and that's the section. And when we talk about flexibility, when we think of what the middle frontal gyrus is involved in, a lot of discussion is things like, and again, this is a fairly large area, it's because of the way that FreeSurfer does its mapping. But again, we can talk about cognitive flexibility, right? And so I think the second part of this short presentation is to talk about that. And I'll move to another study with adult bilinguals. So these are adult bilinguals we did something very strange in this study, so I have to spend a little bit of time explaining it. So you might say, well, why does it, if these are bilinguals, are they German bilinguals? No, actually, they're not German bilinguals. So the two groups are Spanish-English bilinguals. Most of them learn Spanish at home, English at school. And the children were like that. You saw that they were speaking both languages. There's a discussion about whether they're sequential, like are they, how much English do they really have? But that's sort of an open question. But again, more Spanish in childhood and then transition towards more English as they become literate in English, go to college in English, etc. Those bilinguals and monolinguals, so that's the M, right? English monolinguals. And what we did is we taught them German, actually. So we taught them words in German that were either cognates or non-cognates. And then we had them get to 90% correctness. And when they got to 90% correctness, we stuck them in the scanner and we said, okay, here are the words. Now tell me if it's living or non-living. Now this is a really hard task. As you can tell by the brain activity, this was, and again, these are comparisons between groups, right? But the interesting thing was that the monolinguals were actually slower than the bilinguals in making these living, non-living judgments, semantic judgments on these new words in German, right? Newly learned. And we didn't give them phonology, it was just the visual form. Than the bilinguals. And they also showed activity in a lot of these cognitive control related areas, right? So again, the anterior cingulate cortex, thought to be involved in error monitoring, been talked about as sort of having some bilingual involvement. The caudate, thought to be involved in conditional routing, right? Sort of having to overcome the preponderant response, highly connected to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the supplementary motor area, another area that's roughly a supplementary motor area. And the bilinguals showed increased activity in the putamen. Remember when I talked about the balanced children back here, we talked about more volume in the putamen, and interestingly, more activity for bilinguals in the putamen when making these judgments about these newly learned words, which is kind of interesting. It's an interesting finding. And so more recently, we began to sort of think about, well, you know, there's this sort of general cognitive control effect, right? So there have been these studies looking at genetics and cognitive controls. One particular gene, the DRD2 TAC1A polymorphism, it's associated with striatal dopamine. And it's associated with better cognitive control. And we thought, okay, so wait, if we could cross, you know, there's this not so new literature now on the bilingual cognitive advantage, but we thought, well, maybe there's some way we could cross linguistic experience, right, bilingual, monolingual, with presence or absence of this gene. And I won't tell you much about what we found in a preliminary study, although it was kind of interesting. What I will kind of come back to when I'm talking about cognitive flexibility, and I'll get back to the genes in a second, is the number of subjects that we had in this published study. It's published, right? 16 versus 16. And so oftentimes I say, this is such a beautiful finding, right? But again, and we do have activity differences in different areas. So that is helpful. It turns out one way to overcome a small number of subjects is multivariate analysis. So I'm a little bit more comfortable, but again, it's 16 versus 16. That's a very small number. So I just wanted to call attention to that I always qualify this finding because it'd be nice to replicate it. Going back to dopamine, so and we've done a few studies, right, looking at this particular gene. And one study we did was comparing two different genes, one that sort of cortical dopamine, so this COMT, which is associated with cortical dopamine. So you can see that there's cortical low, medium, or high cortical dopamine, and the A1 minus A1 plus, which is associated with subcortical dopamine. So A1 minus has low subcortical, A1 plus is high subcortical. So again, it's two different genes, and in a second I'll throw in a couple of more wrinkles and I'll try to explain what the take home from this study is, because it was pretty mind-blowing. So we took a group of 130 bilinguals actually. So it's a pretty good number. We used these two genes, so these are regression lines. We looked at the age of acquisition of the second language, right? So roughly till about, I think about 15 is probably the oldest we get when we get to college students, although we get some people a little bit older. And we looked at their bilingual proficiency, and this measure actually is a measure of balance. So it's not, up means not just higher proficiency, but it means more balanced. So they actually get brownie points for being balanced in their languages, and they get extra brownies if they're high, right? So it's actually a nice measure because it's a measure of how balanced they are. So it really should be bilingual proficiency plus balance. And what you see is what I would call a spaghetti graph, right? So there are all these different effects. And what I want to call attention to you is really the one after 5, because these are regression lines. So these I'm a little bit more doubtful that they cross in this way. I believe this part of the data more. But what you can see is that better acquisition, right? Or sorry, later acquisition results in more balance, but it depends on these 2 genes, right? And so it's interesting, right? So some people have more balanced proficiency and higher if they have a certain combination of these 2 genes, and I'll explain in a second what the concept is. And others actually end up having better proficiency when they acquire it earlier, when they acquire their second language earlier. And we could account, I think, for about, I want to say about 35% of the variance with this. So again, there's another 65% of the variance we don't account for, but that's a pretty high amount. And again, I think that what it's telling you is that, you know, everyone says, should I learn it early? Should I learn it late? What's better for me? Well, it depends, right? People are different. So, and this is just a conceptual version of that, right? So the conceptual version is that, in fact, for early age of acquisition, it's beneficial to have more subcortical dopamine. For late age of acquisition, it's better, you have a benefit for balance levels when you have, you have a benefit when you have balanced levels of cortical dopamine. So when you have a balanced level of cortical dopamine, at least in our study, later age of acquisition is better. Early age of acquisition is better for more early age of acquisition is associated with better proficiency or balance when there's more subcortical dopamine. And I wanted to end a little bit, since it's a literacy, and I'm kind of taking myself off topic here, but I think you'll appreciate it since we're talking about literacy, and Ken being around sort of inspired me to talk about this, one of my newer projects. So this is from, God, I forget his name, but he's done these very interesting. So he does these explanations. He has this really nice book. It's called Upgoer 5, right? Explained using only the 1,000 words people use the most often. So it turns out that this is the most frequent 1,000 words in English are used to explain all these very complex concepts. And in fact, it turns out the word 1,000 is not one of the 1,000 most frequent words. So he uses 1,000. And the interesting thing about this is, right, it's an Upgoer 5, the only flying space car that's taken anyone to another world. And so you see this very funny explanation. You know, place where fire comes out to help them escape, thing to control which direction the escaping people go, thing to help people escape really fast if there's a problem and everything is on fire, so they decide not to go to space, right? So there's very long explanations, right, that are used to explain very, you know, complex concepts and stuff to burn to make the box with the people and it escaped really fast, right? So we would probably call this, I don't know. Anyway, I don't know I'm not up on my rocket vocabulary, but. So the interesting thing about this for me was a few years ago, in talking to some colleagues and reflecting on my own acquisition of German, I realized that I was having a really hard time learning German because I always wanted to go to a Latin-based word. And so, and I'll tell you a second what my realization about that was. So what I decided to do is I started realizing that, well, German just did things differently. And so I began to think, and other people, I was puzzled because other English speakers would tell me things like, although I don't believe them, they'd say, oh, German is so much easier than Spanish. And I would say, really? I mean, obviously for me, it wouldn't be, but for other people, it might be. And so I thought, why would that be? And so this is just from Celix, right? So this is just the percentage of the 50 most frequent nouns, the percentage of them that are Latin and the percentage of them that are German English, right? And so what you find is that 18% of the words are Latin early in life, right? For monolingual English speakers, 82% come from German and English. In adult everyday language, so I took language from soap operas, American soap operas. It turns out it's about half and half, and I take that as probably everyday kind of, adult language. And if you go to Celix, which is an academic database, it's almost all Latin. So, and you also see this in how they teach. So if we look at prefixes and suffixes taught, this is a school district in Washington, the order that they teach them, what we can see is that most prefixes and suffixes are sort of English, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, if you will. And then over time, the number of prefixes and suffixes in Latin and Greek increases tremendously. So along with a group of students who very kindly coded all these words, we took 20,000 words from, that was a combination of an age of acquisition database and a reaction time database. And so what we did is we actually put those together and we did all the etymologies of 20,000 words, and we had to do them by hand. Maybe some really good computational linguist could find a way to do this in an automated way, but even by hand, it was really tricky. We had a lot of words where we were stuck. So for example, the word fraternal, right? So, the word Bruder, which is, brother. The brother is the English word. Bruder is the German, right, word. But it turns out that Bruder, right, or brother, comes from frater. So do you judge that as a Latin word or as a Germanic word? And so we judge it as a Germanic word because even though it came from Latin, it went through German first. So it gets really tricky to figure out these etymologies. So this was a lot of work to do. But the data are beautiful, right? Because what the data show you is that early in life, the early acquired, and these are adults rating when they learn the words, not kids actually using them. The words are mostly Germanic. The high frequency words are Germanic, so that's the blue that you see. And over time, you can see this huge wave, and actually it's kind of underestimated because below this blue is this huge, huge gargantuan wave of Latin-based words in English. And I actually took some pictures of this just so you could see this. It's very, very crude way to look at it, but I took the very early learned words like potty or hug or snack, and you can see a lot of these words. There's a lot of Anglo-Saxon and very few Latinates, a few here and there like grandpa or like cartoon or flower, but most of them in crayon, most of them are Anglo-Saxon words. If you go a little bit later on age 5, Anglo-Saxon and Latin, Latin begins to creep in more. Same if we go to 7, and then I just jumped all the way to 12 to almost 13. You can see there's this huge Latin wave of words that are creeping into English, right? So this, again, the number of words that are creeping in, they become more and more Latin-like. And again, I just want to go back to the two different ways that we can say astronaut, right? Which is Astron and Nautis, right? Which is star sailor. And in German, it's Weltraumfahrer, right? The world room farer, right? So it's basically someone who's going around like a seafarer, right? But a world farer. So notice that, again, English has kind of cut off all this compounding that German does to create complex words. And it's taken on lexically words from Latin and from Greek, but without the compounding. So we don't know, unless you've studied Latin or Greek and learned all the roots, we don't know what the roots of the words are. We just take them as single vocabulary items. A language like German does something interesting, which is compounding. And so you can actually break the words down into their pieces, which is something you do in English. You do have compounds, but they're not nearly as many and they're not as long as they are in German. So English is what I'm trying to make the point is English is a very interesting language and it lays out on age of acquisition. And my suggestion sort of is that this really wreaks havoc with learning to read in English. And I guess on my more radical days, I would even argue that no one really should learn as a kid to read English. They probably should speak it if they want to read it, but they would be better off, and again, I'm being really radical here, so I want to see what Ken's thoughts on this are, that they would be better off learning German and German, the most common Germanic language, and Romance language, and becoming literate in that, making sure that they spoke English so they could get the phonology, because the phonology is tricky, but then learning to read English maybe around 5 or 6 or maybe even 10. They might even be better at reading English if they had the roots of English, which are German and Latin. and they're laid out across time with age of acquisition. So again, this is just to explain sort of the difference between sensorimotor plasticity and cognitive flexibility. And I didn't get much time to talk about neuroemergentism, but that's just some ideas that we have looking at sort of how development plays out and how there's this sort of dynamic reorganization. The idea of neuronal recycling actually is an old idea, well before Dehaene proposed it. Elizabeth Bates actually just suggested that language is a new machine built out of old parts. Essentially that idea she took and co-opted from somebody else who had it. So in fact, the idea of neuronal recycling itself has been around for a while. One of the things that we're working on in terms of theoretically is neuronal recycling is interesting, but it's not dynamic in that sense. And so I think we need to bring in more dynamic models, which are more complex to really understand how things develop across time. And I will end thanking everyone who helped out, including those who fed the tree and kept the tree of science alive.
Thank you very much, Professor Arturo Hernandez, for the excellent talk, thought-provoking, very inspiring. So that we can get to the questions in the end, I will now invite then my dear friend, Professor Augusto Buchweitz, who is professor in the School of Health Sciences at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio Grande do Sul, where he's also a member of the faculty in the graduate program in medicine, in psychology, and in linguistics. Augusto is a member of the National Conference for Literacy, founding member of the Brazilian Network for Science for Education, a research fellow of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, affiliated researcher of Haskins Labs, where he's also a member of the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, and the principal investigator of various pioneering research projects in Brazil related to the brain basis of early literacy, dyslexia, and also the effects of violence on neurocognitive development. Augusto, it's really a great pleasure to listen to you. Thank you so much for accepting to take part in this session.
Thank you, Mailce. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I will, Ken and Arturo, I will switch to Portuguese in a second. Just let me say that it is an honor to follow you, and I've prepared the slides in English, so you should be able to follow what I am talking about. And I think Arturo has some knowledge of Portuguese. At least he's been trying to talk to us in Portuguese a few times. But I'll switch to Portuguese, and I'll be presenting not only some of the evidence about the brain bases of learning to read, but also some of our work at the Brain Institute of Rio Grande do Sul. Então agora eu passo para português. Eu estava agradecendo os professores e eu vou começar a minha apresentação com um pouco de contextualização. O Instituto do Cérebro do Rio Grande do Sul, nessa foto, né, faz parte da PUC do Rio Grande do Sul. Eu coloquei ali uma imagem da fase 2 do Instituto do Cérebro, que agora está em construção. E o projeto Acerta, que é um projeto que desde 2013 faz parte do Instituto do Cérebro, já está, digamos assim, integrado, né, no DNA do Instituto do Cérebro. E desde então já avaliamos mais de 900 crianças no ambulatório de aprendizagem, onde contamos com alunos de iniciação científica, mestrado, doutorado e o trabalho essencial e voluntário de fonoaudiólogos. Dessas 900 crianças que nos procuraram com dificuldades de aprender a ler, 100 foram diagnosticadas com dislexia do desenvolvimento. Então, mais ou menos uma em cada 9 das crianças que nos procuraram, de fato, tinham um transtorno de aprendizagem. As outras 800 fazem parte de diferentes situações, mas muitas delas representantes de crianças que não têm a oportunidade adequada, sistemática de aprender a ler no nosso país. Tá? Mais de 80 crianças dessas 100 participaram nos experimentos com ressonância magnética. Eu vou trazer um pouco dos resultados, principalmente os resultados que corroboram a literatura internacional. O objetivo sendo, dentro dessa apresentação, e de uma maneira geral, enfatizar pela bilionésima vez, e sabendo da importância dessa ênfase, que aprender a ler não é um processo natural, né, no desenvolvimento, é um processo que necessita instrução. Então, diferente da linguagem oral e de aprender a falar, como o Ken também enfatizou muito bem, trazer um pouco das bases neurais da dislexia também nas crianças brasileiras e terminar com um breve argumento sobre a importância de também se replicar os estudos na neurociência cognitiva no Brasil, para a gente vencer mais um obstáculo, né, na tentativa de ajudar a informar a educação de maneira geral, sendo esse o obstáculo de não ter evidências com crianças brasileiras. Então, o ponto-chave inicial, né, e que já foi apresentado brilhantemente aqui pelo Kenneth Pugh, e falando de reciclagem neuronal, né, quando uma criança aprende a ler, é preciso que ela aprenda processos psicológicos, né, que não são naturais, né, ela vai ter que aprender associações entre um sistema visual inventado pelo homem e o som da linguagem, num nível muito mais granular do que a linguagem oral em si necessita. E o cérebro dessa criança vai precisar mudar, ele vai precisar se adaptar, e também vai precisar adaptar, além desses processos psicológicos que envolvem letras e sons, ou grafemas e fonemas, vai precisar adaptar o seu processo visual, né, como palavras são percebidas, palavras no sentido, o meio visual. Tá? Então, eu vou falar brevemente sobre essa adaptação, dar alguns exemplos, e depois partir para os nossos estudos aqui no Instituto do Cérebro do Projeto Acerta. Um exemplo que eu sempre gosto de dar é um exemplo simples, mas ele ajuda a refletir um pouco sobre como que a aprendizagem da leitura, o fato de termos inventado a escrita e essa representação visual e mais granular dos sons da língua, muda como a gente precisa perceber a linguagem oral. Então, um exemplo que eu gosto de dar são os palíndromos. E por que os palíndromos? Que são essas brincadeiras com linguagem, né, na qual uma frase, se lida de trás para frente, ficaria igual. Mas é interessante perceber que os palíndromos vão surgir, evidentemente, somente após a escrita, e que eles só são possíveis com a escrita. Né? Por que eu gosto de fazer esse argumento? E eu tenho aqui um exemplo em português, né? O Socorro me subi no ônibus em Marrocos, e um exemplo ali depois também em inglês, que inclusive é um palíndromo perfeito, que não só de trás para frente é a mesma palavra, top spot, mas os sons são exatamente os mesmos de trás para frente, né, da direita para a esquerda para a direita. Mas quando eu gravo, e eu gravei a mim mesmo falando essa frase, Socorro me subi no ônibus em Marrocos, e eu toco ela de trás para frente, eu não tenho um palíndromo sonoro. Isso aqui é o palíndromo de trás para frente. Então, não tem nada nesse palíndromo de trás para frente, ou, digamos assim, no áudio de trás para frente, que remeta e que me permita reconstituir essa frase como eu reconstituo ela com as letras. E aqui é o exemplo do top spot. Então, nem com top spot de trás para frente, eu consigo estabelecer exatamente a mesma frase. Então, qual é o argumento aqui? O argumento é que o palíndromo, assim como muitas outras habilidades de segmentação da língua, são consequência, né, da nossa aprendizagem da leitura, mas também são fundamentais para ela. Faz parte da aprendizagem da leitura conseguir fazer esse novo tipo de associação, e esse novo tipo de associação vai precisar de adaptações no cérebro. Um outro processo psicológico que precisa mudar tem relação com a maneira como o ser humano naturalmente processa imagens e símbolos, objetos visuais, em relação à sua orientação horizontal, né? Esquerda, direita ou espelhamento. Então aqui, esse exemplo eu tiro do livro Reading in the Brain, do Stanislas Dehaene, com exceção do laçador. O laçador não está no livro, o exemplo do livro é a Mona Lisa e a Estátua da Liberdade, que vocês obviamente reconhecem, né, os três símbolos. Tá? Só que todos os três estão invertidos. Tá? E essa inversão da Mona Lisa, na realidade, ela está virada para o lado esquerdo de quem está de frente para ela. A Estátua da Liberdade segura a tocha com a mão direita e o laçador é destro, não é canhoto, pelo menos para segurar o laço. Não interferem na nossa habilidade de reconhecer essas imagens, esses símbolos visuais, porque o cérebro humano, antes de aprender a ler, ele não se importa, ele não dá bola para a orientação horizontal em termos de reconhecimento. Mas depois vai acontecer, e exaustivamente a gente já bateu nessa tecla também, que durante a aprendizagem da leitura, a criança vai ter que aprender que esse risco e bolinha não têm o mesmo valor na escrita e na leitura se forem espelhados, ou mesmo que você não pode espelhar uma letra. Né? Então essa adaptação vai se relacionar com uma rede da leitura que, como o Ken bem colocou, vai, de certa forma, pegar uma carona em cima do cérebro da linguagem. São regiões posteriores, né? Então essa região em azul é uma região bem na junção do lobo parietal com o lobo temporal e que se especializa para fazer as associações entre grafema e fonema, inclusive no desenvolvimento da leitura é uma região que fica no meio do traçado da rota fonológica, né? Da criança que está aprendendo a parte regular da língua. E a região occipitotemporal, também chamada de área da forma visual das palavras, que vai se especializar para identificação e diferenciação, vai quebrar essa invariância de espelho das letras. Então, especificamente para a variância em espelho, ela vai diferenciar letras que estão orientadas para a esquerda ou para a direita. Mas nós não perdemos, por exemplo, a invariância de fontes, né? O exemplo no slide que eu coloquei, eu variei algumas fontes que eu usei para escrever, e nós conseguimos ler uma palavra escrita em fonte cursiva, fonte jornalística, enfim, letras maiúsculas, letras separadas, e de todos os outros tipos de fontes, independente, né, do que foi utilizado, porque a gente tem, ao mesmo tempo, uma capacidade invariante e variante na percepção. Mas a variação espelho precisa ser quebrada. Então, partindo desses processos básicos que precisam acontecer e estão na base da aprendizagem da leitura, sempre lembrando o objetivo final de formar um leitor que compreenda texto, vai depender da automatização e aprendizagem de processos básicos, para que esses processos não sejam um obstáculo, e sim sejam um fundamento, né, de uma leitura com fluência, com acurácia, e que vai permitir para a criança ler para aprender, que ainda é um desafio a ser atingido no Brasil. Né? Mas existem algumas crianças, como aquelas 10% mais ou menos, que nós identificamos no ambulatório do Projeto Acerto, que tem uma dificuldade de aprender a ler, pois tem a dislexia do desenvolvimento. Né? E a dislexia do desenvolvimento tem uma característica que a gente pode entender em 3 níveis completamente relacionados. Né? Então, no nível comportamental, ela se apresenta com uma leitura que é persistentemente e inesperadamente lenta, né, e inacurada. Então, a criança ela tem dificuldade de progredir, mesmo com a instrução adequada e, evidentemente, eliminando outras possibilidades e outros fatores que possam estar agindo, né, como obstáculo para a aprendizagem da leitura. Então, é um diagnóstico e uma avaliação bastante multidisciplinar e, no Instituto do Cérebro, envolve 4 encontros, por exemplo, né, com diferentes profissionais. No nível psicológico, ela envolve principalmente uma dificuldade de cristalizar, de solidificar as relações entre grafema e fonema, ao passo que uma criança que está aprendendo a ler naturalmente, ela começa a automatizar esses processos. A criança com dislexia de desenvolvimento, ela caracteristicamente tem uma dificuldade de automatizar e de solidificar essas associações para que elas deixem de ser um obstáculo. E no nível neurobiológico, existem, como o Kenneth Pugh também já apresentou, né, diferenças de funcionamento e estrutura no cérebro que nós também vamos colocar. Mas eu acho que um dos pontos também a serem feitos, e que numa ideia de fazer sempre buscar uma ponte com a educação, envolve não só entender quais são os sinais precoces da dislexia, né, que envolvem atrasos de fala, atrasos de articulação de palavras, né, eu dou um exemplo ali em inglês do pasqueri para o spaghetti, mas se pode fazer o mesmo exemplo para o inglês, que a criança para o português, que a criança precisa atingir uma maturidade de articulação até os 5 anos, provavelmente até antes, deveria, né? Dificuldades com rimas, identificação de sons, né? E existe um laboratório, um grupo de pesquisa da Harvard, da Nadine Gabb, que publicou um diagrama bem interessante que eles chamam o paradoxo da dislexia, que justamente a dislexia, e essa pergunta ela ressurge, né, diversas vezes que a gente fala do assunto, ela vai ter um diagnóstico que, na média, acontece aos 9 anos de idade. Tá? E é o melhor momento para se intervir e tentar ajudar essa criança a mitigar os efeitos da dislexia, que seria na pré-escola, mas para você fazer isso, você precisa de informação. Então, em termos de Brasil, tentando, né, manter a ideia desse webinário, né, de contextualizar a investigação, esse paradoxo ele pode, digamos assim, ser ainda pior. Tá? Então, é evidente que o nosso estudo não é epidemiológico e ele não pode necessariamente ser generalizado para a população brasileira, mas no projeto Acerta, a idade média de diagnóstico das crianças, que são crianças, em geral, de extrato médio e baixo socioeconômico, é de 11 anos ou mais. Então, são crianças que já estão dentro do sistema educacional, pensando que elas entram com 6 na escola e com 4 na pré-escola, né, já estão na escola pelo menos há 5 anos, somando com a pré-escola, são 7 anos. Tá? O Brasil tem uma peculiaridade, e que não é apenas do Brasil, é característico também, por exemplo, da Argentina, que não há testes padronizados de habilidades de leitura, sejam elas habilidades fundamentais como consciência fonológica, decodificação, ou mesmo algum nível de compreensão ou de nomeação, até o 3º ano, né, que é quando acontece a Avaliação Nacional de Alfabetização, a ANA. Na Argentina é a mesma situação. Então, dentro desse paradoxo, uma grande dificuldade que nós temos é que não há uma avaliação sistemática na pré-escola, ou pelo menos, né, em todos os anos do ensino fundamental, para se saber como as crianças estão evoluindo, quais são as crianças que estão com mais dificuldade, e não se fala aqui necessariamente de diagnóstico, mas se fala, sim, de entender todo o processo. Né? E dentro dessa discussão, a discussão socioeconômica ela é fundamental, porque se sabe que a criança em escola particular, a criança de classe média alta, se ela está fracassando na aprendizagem da leitura, ela vai ter acompanhamento, os pais vão buscar alguma coisa. Infelizmente, em geral, é direcionado para a criança, culpa disso, né? Não havendo, inclusive nas escolas particulares, uma reflexão sobre seus métodos de ensino em geral. Né? Mas esse paradoxo, digamos assim, ele afeta as crianças de baixo extrato socioeconômico muito mais fortemente, porque são elas que não têm avaliação e não têm um mapeamento e um acompanhamento até o 3º ano, e mesmo chegando no 3º ano, na ANA é uma avaliação muito geral e que não tem necessariamente um retorno para as escolas, no sentido de sistematizar a recuperação da criança, que já está no 3º ano. E no Brasil, especificamente, também a dislexia do desenvolvimento não faz parte dos transtornos de aprendizagem regulamentados, enfim, e observados. Então, indo para as nossas crianças, é óbvio que não são todas as crianças que não conseguem ler que são disléxicas, muito pelo contrário, a porcentagem de crianças que vai ser disléxica varia um pouco, mas vai variar de 5% até um pouco mais de 10%, aí tendo uma relação também com a ortografia ser mais opaca ou transparente, né? Porque a dislexia, diferente de síndromes, por exemplo, ela não é categórica, né? Ela não é assim, ela não é disléxico, não tem um ponto certo para se estabelecer, mas ela é parte de um contínuo, né? Então, por exemplo, aqui eu tenho as 126 crianças do nosso, 131 crianças do nosso estudo longitudinal, e que aproximadamente 26 delas, se a gente pegar o padrão de 2 desvios padrão abaixo da média, poderiam ser disléxicas, e isso representa quase 20%. É óbvio que não existe essa porcentagem. Tá? Então, o que nós temos é uma situação em que tem muito mais crianças que não estão lendo, ou estão lendo como leria uma criança disléxica, e eu vou destrinchar um pouco esses dados para vocês, e que não tem, e que estão nessa situação por um desamparo que começa lá na pré-escola. Tá? Eu nunca me esqueço de um pesquisador finlandês, o Pekka Hassinen, que é especialista em matemática e por muitos anos trabalhou no México e conhece os níveis de aprendizagem de matemática da América Latina e do México. E o comentário dele sobre o nível de matemática das crianças que se tem no Brasil é que uma criança brasileira, no nível que começa a fazer a avaliação ali na Prova Brasil, que está, né, abaixo, digamos, mais ou menos na média, é praticamente uma criança com descalculia na Finlândia, né, de tão dispare que é o nosso nível de aprendizagem. Tá? Então, eu tentei, brevemente, eu vou destrinchar alguns dos dados aqui sobre, por exemplo, a acurácia, né, desses grupos de leitores que nós temos. Os leitores que a gente acabou chamando de regular são leitores que a gente teve dificuldade de classificar como bons leitores. Nesse caso da acurácia, eles parecem bons leitores, mas há outras avaliações em que eles têm uma disparidade um pouco maior em relação aos que nós chamamos de bons leitores. Vocês podem ver que o mau leitor do nosso grupo longitudinal e das crianças que não têm diagnóstico, ele tem um desempenho muito parecido em termos de acurácia com a criança com dislexia, inclusive a sua média sendo pior. Tá? O que acontece na dislexia, a gente tem uma variabilidade muito maior. Né? Isso é bem característico do grupo com dislexia. Então, aqui, de novo, no 4º ano, as crianças pareadas mais ou menos para a idade, com a dislexia também, a velocidade de leitura total para diferentes tipos de palavras. Mas aí tem um dado interessante que eu quis trazer sobre os bons leitores especificamente, e se a gente olha as velocidades de leitura e acurácia de palavras regulares, irregulares e pseudopalavras, e para dar exemplos, né? Uma palavra regular é uma palavra que só tem uma maneira de ser lida, como pato. Né? Uma palavra irregular pode ser uma palavra que tem mais de uma opção de leitura e que não tem, por exemplo, um diacrítico que marca essa opção, como bola, que pode ser lida como bola. Né? E a pseudopalavra, que é uma palavra inventada, mas com combinações entre letras, consoantes e vogais possíveis em português. Então, especificamente para as palavras irregulares, mais do que para as outras, a gente vê que os leitores, nossos bons leitores, digamos assim, eles são bastante mais apurados do que o resto, mas eles não são necessariamente tão mais rápidos, e a diferença na velocidade não é estatisticamente significativa entre eles e os maus leitores, por exemplo. Ela fica próximo de estatisticamente significativa, e ela muda um pouco no 5º ano, ela acaba se distanciando um pouco, mas no 4º ano ainda dá para ver que a velocidade de leitura deles para palavras irregulares não é tão díspare dos grupos dos seus colegas, dos seus pares que estão com dificuldade na acurácia. Então, eles leem com acurácia, mas leem devagar, e esse componente da velocidade é um componente que compõe, né? Faz parte do construto de fluência, que envolve acurácia e velocidade de leitura, e é um construto que não é avaliado no Brasil, e então não se tem essa ideia, né, do quão rápido as crianças estão lendo, apesar da fluência ser um dos melhores preditores da boa alfabetização e aprendizagem da leitura e formação de leitores. Né? Então, esse paradoxo ele pode se apresentar de uma maneira pior, quando a gente não tem a informação, né? A gente leva muito tempo para avaliar Aqui o exemplo que eu dei para vocês era da velocidade, né? E o Brasil precisa reavaliar suas políticas de testagem e avaliação das crianças em diferentes momentos, inclusive, se possível, na pré-escola, né? Mas certamente antes do 3º ano, porque não se tem informação sistemática e clara antes disso. Então, passando disso para a parte neurobiológica, o que eu queria argumentar aqui e trazer os nossos dados, e, bom, os nossos dados não são tão diferentes, não trazem necessariamente uma novidade em relação ao que existe na literatura, mas o que a gente traz é uma replicação em mais uma língua das evidências não só da parte psicológica e comportamental, da dislexia, da aprendizagem da leitura, mas da parte neurobiológica. Duas diferenças robustas e replicadas na literatura envolvem diferenças em volume de massa cinzenta e conexões de massa cinzenta dessas partes posteriores do cérebro, né, principalmente aquela parte do parietal inferior, que está envolvida com a conversão grafema-fonema. Né? Esse aqui é o estudo da Fumiko, que o Ken, colega do Ken, lá do Haskins também. E as diferenças também funcionais de ativação da área da forma visual das palavras. Aqui um estudo já bastante antigo e muito citado, que replicou em 3 línguas, né? No francês, no italiano e no inglês, que as 3 têm diferentes níveis de opacidade, e nas 3 se encontrou essa diferença funcional, menos ativação da área da forma visual das palavras, que acaba sendo um dos melhores marcadores, neuromarcadores de aprendizagem da leitura. E as nossas crianças aqui no Brasil, né? Os dados que eu vou trazer para vocês são de 2 tarefas, né? Uma delas com leitura de palavras e pseudopalavras na ressonância, outra do que a gente chama de estado de repouso, em que elas não fazem tarefa alguma durante 7 minutos, mas a gente investiga como as áreas do cérebro estão conversando entre si, especificamente nesse caso, as áreas da leitura. E, por fim, também um estudo da neuroanatomia dessas crianças. Então, a gente replica, e isso é um bom sinal, era o que a gente esperava e precisava fazer, se não replicasse, haveria algo de errado, de uma diferença significativa em termos de ativação da área da forma visual das palavras entre disléxicos e crianças com dificuldade de leitura com leitores típicos. E aqui leitores típicos podem incluir também aqueles mais regulares, não são necessariamente os bons leitores, digamos assim, né? E essa diferença se revelou em todos os tipos de palavras lidas. E no estudo do estado de repouso, o que a gente fez? A gente pegou a área da forma visual das palavras, como o que a gente chama de semente, de seed, e perguntou fez um estudo exploratório e perguntou assim, existe alguma região no cérebro em que há uma diferença significativa de comunicação dessa região com o hub, digamos assim, das redes default do cérebro em repouso. Então, quando o nosso cérebro está em repouso, ele entra num estado de repouso e existe no símbolo posterior, que é essa área azul, aí no slide, uma espécie de hub central para o estado do repouso, e com o qual a conectividade da área da forma visual das palavras, e vocês podem ver isso na barra à direita, chega a ser negativa, né? Ou seja, a área da forma visual das palavras não está conversando com esse hub em repouso nos disléxicos, mas os leitores típicos existe uma conectividade, uma correlação, né? Uma conversa entre as duas bastante positiva. E se a gente pega e faz esse mesmo estudo para, por exemplo, as áreas auditivas, né, de processamento auditivo, tanto o disléxico como o leitor típico vai ter uma comunicação, né, do lobo temporal com esse hub da rede default. Então, na leitura, especificamente em repouso, parece que o estado de repouso do disléxico não inclui um estado, digamos assim, de prontidão para leitura, como incluiria para processamento auditivo. E, por fim, apresentando a parte neuroanatômica e neurobiológica, a gente compilou os exames de neuroanatomia, os exames estruturais de 59 crianças com dislexia e 41 leitores, aí, bons leitores e alguns aqueles regulares. E justamente nessas regiões temporoparietais, que nós já apresentamos aí como um dos hubs de processamento né, de associações entre grafema e fonema, que faz parte da literatura mundial em termos de diferenças entre o cérebro da criança com dislexia e a criança que consegue aprender a ler sem maiores obstáculos, está justamente nessa diferença de volume que a gente replicou, né? Então, de novo, né, aparecendo nas nossas crianças o que se encontra na literatura mundial. E dentro desse objetivo, nós temos agora um estudo que está finalizado e em fase de análise, e que a mesma tarefa foi feita em diversas línguas graças ao Haskins Laboratories, do Ken, que desenhou uma tarefa de localização de linguagem, que as crianças têm que ler palavras, veem símbolos, assim, que não são palavras, né? Escutam palavras, escutam ruídos, e a gente faz uma localização das áreas associadas com o processamento auditivo e de leitura. E tanto nas crianças, os bons leitores brasileiros, né, e norte-americanos, ainda faltando aqui os poloneses, que fazem parte desse estudo, encontramos a mesma, né, agrupando os dois, a mesma diferença de mais ativação da área da forma visual das palavras. E veja que aqui são, inclusive, duas línguas de opacidades diferentes, né? E não só se replica esse achado separadamente, mas quando nós juntamos os grupos, ele permanece, ele sobrevive. Então, por fim, de novo, bater nessa tecla de que a leitura não é natural, do que a gente tem na psicologia cognitiva e na neurociência cognitiva, já evidências sendo replicadas na neurociência mais recentemente, mas na psicologia cognitiva, nos estudos da ciência da leitura já há décadas, desde a década de 70, sistemática e repetidamente evidências de como uma criança aprende a ler, tá? E a importância do ensino sistemático, das associações entre letras e sons, como isso é importante para como o cérebro precisa se adaptar. E no caso aqui do Brasil também de uma necessidade de mais atenção para o processo, né, de alfabetização da criança e das habilidades de consciência fonológica e conhecimento alfabético, tanto na pré-escola como no primeiro ano do ensino fundamental, sobre os quais a gente não tem ideia alguma, né, de como as crianças estão chegando na escola. Os mecanismos, é importante replicar essa ideia de mecanismos de aprendizagem neurobiológicos e psicológicos, porque a gente precisa eliminar essa ideia de que a aprendizagem é mágica, a aprendizagem é uma arte, ensinar é uma arte. É evidente que ninguém quer tirar o papel do professor, é o professor que precisa ter informação para melhor adaptar o ensino às crianças com as quais ele está trabalhando, mas também se precisa tirar esse mito de que existe uma mágica para ensinar as crianças. O meio como as crianças aprendem e a maneira de ensinar, existem maneiras que sistematicamente e repetidamente se apresentam como mais efetivas. Os mecanismos de aprendizagem são os mesmos, né, em diferentes culturas, então a gente precisa desmitificar a aprendizagem e entender que existem procedimentos e protocolos que podem ser seguidos, assim como outras áreas diferentes da educação fazem, tá? E isso é para ajudar o professor. Esse é outro momento de outra quebra de paradigma que precisa acontecer, porque uma das primeiras respostas é que se quer controlar o professor e transformar as crianças em robôs. Na verdade, o que a gente quer é que as crianças não sejam robôs, porque quem aprende a ler nunca será um robô, né? E a ideia de se afastar desse wait to fail, né, de que toda criança tem seu tempo, porque isso não é verdade. Exatamente a partir do quarto, quinto ano, existe um pico de abandono escolar, e certamente esse pico de abandono escolar no Brasil tem relação direta com o analfabetismo e a frustração das crianças de estar na escola, tá? Tem muita gente para agradecer do nosso laboratório, essa é uma foto que precisa ser atualizada, inclusive, e, claro, agradecer, also Haskins Laboratories and Ken, por toda a ajuda até aqui para esse trabalho multinacional. So, that's it.
Sorry. So thank you, Augusto. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. It's always good to listen to you, to hear you. We have many questions. So Augusto and I will take turns in presenting the questions, and we're going to do that in rounds. So one question for each of you, and then the second round and so on. So I'll start with a question for Ken. Professor Pugh, could you explain more about the importance of early oral language for learning to read?
Yes, thank you. That's a great opportunity for me to expand a little bit. So we know that that the delays in, as I showed in that paper that we published from a longitudinal study, we know that sort of overt problems like major delays in the onset of two-word utterances and beyond are certainly a risk factor. On average, the risk is greater for children who show those kinds of delays. And of course, more profound language issues like specific language impairment will also, not surprisingly, elevate the risk for difficulties in reading. But even things as subtle as what are called speech sound disorders, which is misarticulation, they have a small but replicable impact on risk for reading. So lots of ways that the early oral language system manifests itself are predictive of reading. Perhaps the most interesting thing I would normally share in a longer talk, and I'll just mention it briefly. So if the process we talked about, which is the ability to leverage perception production perisylvian systems in order to make reading more automatic and more language-based, and that seems to be the case. That's certainly what we see neurologically. Then it would imply that early difficulties, not just in receptive or expressive, would impact reading. They do. Both expressive and receptive preschool difficulties put kids at elevated risk for reading. That's not an issue. But we made a more subtle discovery and published some papers a few years ago where we looked at a sort of a speech researcher's dream task, where it's called the modified auditory feedback task. And in this task, the subject simply repeats a word over and over again that they are listening to and triggered to repeat. But we have a feedback system to the ear, and at some point we play a little trick on the auditory system. It's harmless and benign, that modifies the feedback to the ear and produces a kind of automatic and unconscious, not perceptually recognized adaptation of the articulation. So in other words, the articulators will adapt in order to adjust to an error signal that we trick the brain into hearing through a modification of the feedback. It's used to study lots of things: stuttering, speech disorders, aging in speech. It's a very useful, and it's very benign, and it goes back to baseline very quickly. The interesting finding was that it was associated, as we might expect, if learning to read depends on the perception action machinery, the perisylvian machinery. It predicted reading difficulties. And here's the interesting thing. It was also the case that children who knew how to read, let's say 30 words, in other words, they had mastered the basic code. They actually, on this incredibly low level, non-reading perception action dynamic, they actually are more sensitive. So their experience than pre-literates. So their experience with reading has produced that kind of feedback, which makes this really simple perception action loop task that's been used so much in speech research highly discriminative. So in summary, there's lots of work on vocabulary and oral language and receptive and expressive and late talking, all of which comports elevated risk for reading difficulties. And so there's a connection, but it seems like it gets all the way down to the level of the behaviors of the perception action systems. And so we continue to explore that. And of course, one of the big questions that Augusto raised in his excellent talk is, what can we do in knowing this to strengthen those oral language skills prior to the child failing to read? And that's an area that we're working on, and happy to talk about it or pass on information later. So of course, knowing what the early language issues are is super important, because we want to be doing prevention rather than remediation.
Thank you. Augusto?
Okay, so Ken, the next question is again for you.
Excuse me, Augusto, let's do
Yes.
that in rounds. So the next question would be for Arturo.
I'll jump to, okay, sorry. Okay, so Arturo, the question is about neuroanatomical differences across early and late bilinguals, and whether they're also related to behavioral differences in language processing.
Good question. So yeah, I would argue that, I mean, so I didn't have time to present that, but there's pretty good evidence that, and again, there's a range of things that are affected by age of acquisition. The one in a paper that Ping Li and I published many years ago, we sort of laid out this sensorimotor hypothesis, this idea that when things that are more sensorimotor in nature, and this is again an extension of Piaget, anybody who's read Piaget would see our extension, but the idea was that very early learning is more sensorimotor based, right? And that later learning is more cognitive, right? And actually going beyond that, we would argue there's constant sensorimotor and eventually over time sensorimotor to association area reorganization as time progresses. So this is not only in adults, but also in kids. And so the argument would be, do those neuroanatomical differences show up as behavioral differences? Absolutely. They're more identifiable in things that are more sensorimotor based, such as accent, than they are in things that are higher level language based. But again, yes, the answer would be yes, absolutely. There are behavioral differences. It's sort of an open question about, the real open question is this sort of critical period question that creeps in about, you know, is it by 7 that you should learn your second language? Is it by puberty? Is it by 20? And what I always tell people is, you know, early is different than late. And the windows close differently for different people, and they can be opened and reopened depending on early experience. So there's pretty good evidence that early experience with multiple phonologies changes the way, or with 2 phonologies changes the way third language acquisition occurs.
Thank you. Fascinating. So Augusto, your question is, do you think that early literacy can have a negative impact on children's neurocognitive development?
That's a good question, because generally when we try to make the argument that preschool in Brazil, especially public preschools, should begin to include teaching phonological awareness or integrating into play phonological awareness and knowledge of the alphabet. One of the first criticisms that comes, that emerges, is that if you begin to practice and work with emergent literacy earlier, you will hinder neurocognitive, motor, emotional development. There's absolutely no evidence that working with emergent literacy and helping kids prepare to learn to read, this sort of school readiness, has effects on motor or emotional development or any other sort of development. Quite the contrary, the evidence is that kids who arrive in elementary school without this basis for learning to read will be the kids who eventually have a greater chance of dropping out and not learning to read properly and so on, and all the consequences that that brings. So that's a very good question, because it mixes with other criticisms such as kids need to play, we don't need to teach them. And that hasn't, no, that's the straw man fallacy, where you're not saying that kids are not going to play. We're not going to, be putting them in front of chalkboards for the whole day. You have to learn these sounds. You're going to integrate these fundamental abilities and skills and knowledge into play and activities and playing with words. And kids love this. Kids love books if they have access to them. So it's an important question, and the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. Your turn now.
Now we go back to Ken, right? So the question is to if you could go a little deeper or talk a little bit more about the process of becoming literate in languages with different orthographic depths, such as Spanish and English and Portuguese, and how can that affect the early processes of reading acquisition?
Sure. Well, it's a deep question, and one that is still, there's not universal consensus in the field on how similar or fundamentally similar all writing systems are. However, there is a really strong evidence basis to say some things. Number one, we know that when studies have been done looking at predictors, particularly work done with very large cohorts of children in different languages, such as the work by Caravallis and Hume, that when we take shallow orthographies like Spanish or Portuguese versus irregular ones like English, there have been some claims made that perhaps phonologic awareness, which is the meta-linguistic understanding that words are made of smaller parts and is necessary in building that triangle, that perhaps that plays less of a developmental role in easier to decode languages. Another factor, without getting too much into the weeds, that is a predictor is called rapid automatized naming, and this measures your ability to take perception and turn it into output quickly. So it's a kind of a phonologic and a motor skill as well. It captures unique variants from phonologic awareness. And the claim has been made by some researchers that in shallow languages, they get evidence for stronger prediction from this speeded phonologic measure, and in English and deeper orthographies from the phonologic. However, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that that may not really be the case. There is a lot of counter evidence suggesting that the balance of predictors as children transition from pre-literacy into literacy are not reliably different between shallow and deep orthographies. There's also an emerging literature, for example, research done by the BCBL in Spain has compared direct instruction that focuses on building these grapheme-phoneme correspondences, which are thought to be so important in deeper orthographies, and compared that kind of teaching of reading in Spanish, in regular Spanish, with a more holistic approach. The evidence was clear and has been clear across the board that focusing the brain, the mind, on the phonologic structures is universal. The evidence that there's not such a profound difference between shallow and deep languages with regard to the building blocks that need to be placed is overwhelming. There are these small debates about which measure predicts best, but even those are suggestive of universality. And lastly, and importantly, because we know that the mechanisms by which the spoken language brain transforms itself in order to become an aid in reading are universal, as we argued and others have argued. There is no reason to think from the point of view of emerging neuroscience that there will be a fundamental difference in how we should approach literacy in vastly different writing systems. So I tend to take a very strong view for universality. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that good teaching is not so different in regular versus irregular languages. There are debates about small issues here and there, but I think from the point of view of what educators and parents need to know, the universality of this reorganization that is demanded by literacy that both Augusto and I talked about is universal. And good teaching and direct instruction, I mean, the evidence on that is overwhelming, is important in all languages.
Thank you, Ken. Excellent. Arturo, so in the case of late learners, when does procedural memory begin to be involved in syntactic processing? Is there always a role of declarative memory in such processing?
Oh, that's a good question. Declarative versus procedural. I mean, so we know that, I mean, God, that's a really good question. I've reflected a lot about that. So I'll tell you a little bit what I think is happening. I mean, so declarative and procedural memory are always available to adults, right? There is some, and I've had discussions with people about, so what about declarative memory? Because, we know procedural memory is there from a very young age. I mean, infants learn new procedures, right? They show conditioning, things of that sort. So the sort of fairly automatic types of learning are available the whole time. One thing that I kind of told Michael Ullman, who's the biggest proponent of this procedural declarative procedural model, was that procedural memory is available. The late learner just doesn't trust it. Right. So a lot of times I would say the right thing in German and then I would correct myself. And if I just said it, even though I wouldn't get it right all the time, I was actually better. And some people obviously argue that if you have a beer or some alcohol, maybe your foreign language ability goes up. So that's kind of up to debate whether it really goes up or we just perceive it as going up because we've had a little too much to drink. But anyway, the real question is, what about declarative memory development? We hardly know there's hardly any discussion. I've talked to Patricia Bauer, who does declarative memory, and she argues, she thinks that declarative memory does exist in infants, but it's quite hard to measure because it's so short. So the question was about late learners and declarative versus procedural. And my answer always goes back to, one, we don't quite think of it as memory. We think of it more as processing. So that's kind of our take on it. But if you want to think about it as memory, then I think we really need a better model of declarative memory development. Procedural memory seems to be always there. Question, does it change over time? How do these systems interact? I've been looking at this literature for years and I don't ever get any straight answer except people saying, well, adults have more declarative, and kids have less declarative. And maybe it breaks down with older age, although it seems to be episodic. So, I think it's just a very hard question to answer. I tend to look at it more from the sign of like, how well do you process the sounds? How well can you conceptualize? And the question was about syntax, right? What are the sensory sort of motor loops you use to process syntax? I think a lot of these are sort of embedded in the phonological code, or what I call the phonoprosodic code. So for example, if we take words like permit versus permit, this is an English example, right? The phonoprosodic code gives you a noun or a verb. And we know that little kids can learn these. So in Spanish, they tend to learn trisyllabic, like la casa, right? As a thing, right? So if you ask a little kid, it's la casa, they learn it as one thing. In English, it's a disyllabic, right? So it's 2 syllables, and those phonoprosodic types of envelopes capture a lot of the syntactic information that we could think of as procedural, and maybe that's one different way to think about it. I think of it as embedded in the sensorimotor signal, right? As opposed to thinking about it as different types of memory. Now, how do you extract that information to use procedural or declarative? I think we need a lot more information on what the development of those memory systems, and I don't really find any in the literature. If somebody knows about development in procedural and declarative memory, please send me the article. Ask Patricia Bowers, she couldn't tell me much.
Thank you. Excellent. The next question is for Augusto, but I think it would be interesting to know your thoughts on that too. So what are the possible consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on children? Yes, on children with dyslexia or with reading difficulties, or even in the case of bilinguals, bilingual children who are learning to read, given that they are not having classes or treatment in the case of dyslexic children. So what are your thoughts on that?
Please, Arturo, go ahead. And I think Ken could also give a good answer, because Haskins has a COVID response initiative in place at this moment. So maybe Ken, you can.
Sure. Arturo, do you want to? Did you want to take a crack at it first?
You go.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, so yes, as Augusto mentioned, the work we do together in this global literacy initiative, we have been focused on how can we, what are the things that can be done to mitigate the expected losses, particularly in kids who are K through 2, who are really making this, as we showed, massive exercise in brain plasticity and reorganization, and are very vulnerable to a loss of training time. So we know in general that even if you go on summer vacation, you can lose up to 1/3 of lessons that had been or of information that learned during the school year in relevant to literacy skills. And so these kids in my country, and I think in most countries, are potentially losing 6 months of this. And that is just is devastating. So the expected loss is profound. There are a number of things that are going on. I will mention, as Augusto alludes to, we are currently, we have an NSF project ongoing where we're using education technology, a kind of a reading game, in conjunction with the teachers and their classes, even though the kids are at home, to see whether, and then frequent online testing, to see whether we can do anything with evidence-based but online learning to mitigate some of the expected losses. And that data is being collected right now under an NSF mechanism. So we will have some report on that by the end of the summer, and I'm happy to share it. There's also a lot of other work going on using some of the standard reading remediation programs like Wilson and Empower and others that have been transferred into online. And I think I'll let Augusto talk about the availability of EdTech in both Brazil and in South America, since he's been a leading force in this. But key thing is this from my side: EdTech is helpful, it's important. We've also put together, and some of this is in Spanish, and I'm not sure, Augusto, whether it's in Portuguese, but resources for parents and teachers. We know a lot about what needs to be reinforced at these ages. And so what we've done as a group is to put together an online resource library, webinars, and other things in order to try to get as much information as we can. The last thing I mentioned on this expected slide is the other side of it. So what's going to happen is not every kid in the US is going to be in our tiny NSF study where we're using the education technology and we hope for good things. Kids are going, and from school to school in the US, and I'm sure this is true everywhere, the ability of the classes to go online has varied tremendously. Some schools did it, some can't, some are having a success, some aren't. What this is going to mean is that when kids come back in the fall, not only will they have had the COVID slide, they will have lost important things, but there will be an exacerbation, an extension of individual differences based on the child and the child's experience. And that's going to make it very difficult in the fall when we think most schools will be back for a teacher to be able to take the standard curriculum and get everybody back into the mix. So there's going to be a real need going forward. And I know that Augusto and others are working on this in Brazil, not only to use education technology to try to mitigate the slide, but also as potentially an aid in conjunction with in-class instruction, which is the key, to try to help to get kids back on track when they're back in school. This is a disaster from the point of view of reading and brain reorganization, of early reading. There's no question. And then last thing as well, as children transition from third grade, from learning to read in first and second grade to reading to learn, and comprehension begins to emerge as a vulnerable area for some kids with specific comprehension difficulties, the same set of questions are there. What can we do for those kids, if nothing else, using ed technology to try to keep them on track for the development of reading comprehension, which is also fragile at certain points and which needs a lot of reinforcement. Augusto, I know you guys have worked with making ed tech available in Brazil. Did you want to address that?
I think we're working towards trying to make this education technology graphic game, more specifically,
right,
available in Portuguese and Spanish for Argentina, Colombia, and Panama at this point. But of course, the structure of what is going to be offered is much less robust than what you have in the United States. Even the evidence for graphical game clearly shows that when it is integrated into classroom practice, that's when it has the largest effect. But I think the answer we can give at this point, because we just don't know what's going to happen, and things in Brazil, the education and health situation in Brazil is very uncertain, to say the least. We don't know how long it's going to take to get back, and at what, how much these kids are going to lose, and of course the idea that what it's going to probably happen is that the kids in the lower strata of social and economic situation are the ones who are going to suffer the most, because they're the ones who are in schools that don't have the ability to offer online teaching and classes. They don't have internet at home. It's very sparse and heterogeneous in Brazil. The cities and states that are trying to offer something for public schools, it isn't, as there isn't a centralized effort to sort of try to make this mitigate the situation. It's impossible to make it the same as being in class, but the mitigation, can help some. But I think for Brazil, the biggest, the most important thing to say is it's very likely that the kids who are usually the ones who fall behind, left behind, struggle more, are also the ones who are not going to have any classes until we're back to school at some point.
Of course, yeah. Here. But, and I would I tend to talk too much, but I'll say very quickly that this, I mentioned these things that are on it's called the Haskins Global Literacy Hub. And we have a website where there are all these what we did is we gathered a lot of people, Arturo, Sharon Vaughn, and Marianne Wolf, and Maureen Lovett, and everybody we know around the planet, to give us their best information on what's out there for families. So for those interested in this, go click on our website. We've created an online resource library based on our experts' advice on which programs, which things to do, which games to play might be most effective. And we continue to update that as a service in all of this, and also to develop content for the webinars. But at the bottom line, if there are, if there is an ability to play these kinds of simple, reinforcing games during the summer, we should do it, because we know kids are going to lose. And so we've got to do everything we can. When those simple, often fun tools are there, they certainly can't hurt, and I think they might help. So please look for opportunities to increase the content to kids that you're interacting with during this time.
I posted the link on YouTube to Haskins Global.
Great.
So it's on the chat there.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
Arturo, any thoughts about bilingual children, bilingualism at home?
I mean, so what I always get stuck on, and I think that's just my approach to thinking about what I would call the cognitive approach to the mind, right, is where we take the cognitive, we distill out some process, right? So we call it literacy. And we distill out what the components of that process are. And for whatever, I don't know why, because biology was not my favorite class. My favorite class was chemistry, actually, and in science. And I always kind of come back to like, so what are the building blocks of this thing we call literacy, or we call language? And so the biggest enrichment, and again, you know, maybe I'm sounding too, like, you know, because musical instruments are expensive, and you know, having notational music is an issue, but you know, families used to play music, right? Like physically play music. They would actually teach, you know, music, reading music, right? Which is a nonverbal form of intelligence. And the one thing that sort of struck me in the whole discussion is sort of the loss of these sort of, you want to call them everyday activities. Now there seemed to be like this thing about having music lessons is a big luxury, but you know, my uncles in Mexico used to play music, and they did not have teachers. It was like a family thing. They weren't poor, they were middle class, but that's what they did. They hardly play music anymore. Now they'll just turn on, you know, YouTube, or they'll play iTunes. And so I do feel in some ways that, you know, there's sort of an extreme move to technology, which I love technology, don't get me wrong. I mean, I love technology, but I feel like the old school of playing music, learning notes, things that are fairly cheap that can be done in a family, it's hard if you know, parents are trying to work, trying to maintain the family. When do you play music? When do you have the time? But I think there's things like that, like art, that now are things that are considered, you know, upper middle class, but that families used to do and teach in the home. And I think those type of enrichment activities of putting color to shape, of putting sound to symbol, are sort of, they feed into literacy quite clearly. And we know that certainly the musical ear seems to run with people's ability. I mean, vocalists seem to be the best polyglots. Actually, they're very good at imitating non-native accents. So my question's always been, if you train that ear early and you train the symbol to music system, right, the non-verbal symbolic system early, you train painting, things like that, you can design games. But people did lots of things to feed those kind of enrichment things that were done in families that were fairly old school and didn't rely on internet connections. And I always wonder, well, you know, why not? I mean, there are people that do this, but why not start music lessons where you have to study symbol and you hopefully get people to actually produce something that they enjoy instead of sitting next to a computer. Computers are great, don't get me wrong, but not everybody has computers. There's some pretty old school ways we could do enrichment that would work, that would not be necessarily cheap, but relatively cheap and less complicated. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Augusto.
Okay, we go to Ken again, right? Ken, the next question to you is about executive function and about, well, if you could talk a little about near and far transfer when training children's executive functions during reading acquisition.
That's a great question. You know, this is an area, by the way, I wanted to just make one additional comment on this, on the COVID issue. There's a growing literature in the literacy field on the complicated relationship between anxiety and anxiety problems and literacy outcomes. And of course, Arturo mentions doing healthy things. that are, good for your brain, good for yourself. And I agree, but I do want to mention that this is really there's a growing. Many of you may know that reading disability is highly comorbid with things like ADHD and problems with executive function, which I'll get to in a second, and with specific language impairment. But it's also now shown to be highly comorbid or overlapping with anxiety disorders, which are on the rise in every country in the world right now, and are going to be even worse when people are recovering from this complete disorientation. So the ways in which anxiety can be mitigated through mindfulness, through breathing, through healthy activities, Arturo reminds us of, are going to actually have, we don't have the measurement yet, we don't have the right mechanism yet, but we know it's there. And it's an area of much research, how the state of readiness relates to reading. And that brings us back, that was not a complete aside, because it brings us back to the question of executive function. What we know about executive function and response control or response inhibition or control is that the same areas that we talked about in my talk and in Augusto's that need to come online for literacy are interacting with the frontostriatal systems that are involved in self-regulation and executive function and self-efficacy and other related constructs. So of course, and in fact, in a paper I published some years ago, we identified the circuit that was predictive of emergent readers. And it included not all just those areas I mentioned, but also this anterior cingulate gyrus, an important system for selective attention and control, and the putamen and the pulvinar and other attentionally sensitive subcortical systems. So given that, we know that self-regulation, executive function needs to prepare the brain to make the language visual connections, to build a triangle, there's no doubt. There's less research on what to do about it, but I'm happy to share this online. There are very good groups working on the problem. There's Fred Morrison and his colleagues at Michigan, and a number of other groups. Clancy Blair and his colleagues at NYU have been working very carefully on how self-regulation and early stressors which can impact it are affecting the ability to crack the code and build literacy. So it's a very strong area of research. It's not as well understood as some aspects of literacy, such as the importance of phonology, but it is understood to be important. And there are emerging data. It's a work in progress now, so I don't want to overstate, but there are some programs to strengthen executive function in preschool children, especially children from impoverished and highly stressed environments, that are meant to get the brain in that state, which is less anxious and more self-regulating, in order to do this puzzle, this reorganization that we were talking about. So yes, it's important. It's an important factor. It is a hotly researched area in a number of countries. I'm aware of this in the US through NIH studies. And I don't think we're not there. We're not where we need to be yet on this, to be honest, but we are at a point at least where there are some programs being developed to strengthen the muscles of executive function in preparation for literacy. And I'm happy to share, I know we're online, but I'm happy to share references from labs like Blair's, Morrison's, and others that I think are doing quite good work on this. Oh, and Arturo, I think people in Houston as well have been working on this. And there's some folks working in this in Harvard, working on anxiety, self-regulation. Big issue. Sorry for the long answer, but I'm happy to share papers with those interested in pursuing it further.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Great, because the next question is also somewhat related to self-regulation and executive functions, stress, etc. So the question is for Arturo. Do you believe that the benefits of yoga in the brain can be used to help language learners especially in the process of vocabulary acquisition now too. The main question is, the effects of yoga in the brain and how to learn.
Wow, yoga. Okay, so I don't do yoga. So it's kind of hard, and I don't know a lot of research on that, but it's sort of an interesting question, right? About when you're trying to accomplish a task. So this is kind of piggybacking on Ken's, answer. And maybe I actually taking his answer and sort of my thought on his answer when he talked about, executive function and how it's involved in self-regulation, but we also think of it as being involved in cognitive processing, right?
Right.
And so I do think that there are different modes of processing, right, that occur when we're in different brain states. I think there's a fairly large literature on we talked about procedural versus declarative. You could talk about spaced learning, right? So if we learn things across time rather than what they call, just doing it all in one chunk, we actually space it over time. Our learning is better. And people who do these kinds of studies will actually tell you, no, I'm actually doing worse in this condition. They actually are not aware that they're doing better. And somehow, I think it has to do the level of what we think we're doing, awareness versus what we're learning, doesn't always match up. So that would be one answer. Would yoga help? It could, right? It could relax you and put you in, and building again on Ken's sort of point about relaxation and learning, it could. Do we sometimes have to kind of struggle and fight through things? There's something also called desirable difficulties, which seem to help in learning. That also helps. Should we be battling all the time to learn? No. So there's probably some mix of different emotional and cognitive attentional states that help us to learn. And we need to be in the variety of these to learn, right? And one could be a relaxed state. But we are going to be stressed sometimes when we do language, and we're going to have to be able to deal with stress and sort of handle it in real time. So we can do things to help us with that as well. So I would argue, sure, why not? And the last answer would be, we know that if you learn in different types of contexts, right? So there's contextual reinstatement, you actually have better memory. So there is a tricky part, that is if you learn your language when you're doing yoga, be a little bit careful, because it may not appear as easily when you don't do yoga. So you're gonna have to practice what you do in yoga outside of yoga for it to generalize. So I think anything you can do to improve your language exposure is helpful. I mean, anything that you can do that motivates you and gets you more language exposure is helpful. Yoga could help, but I don't have a really solid answer. I haven't seen much science on that.
Okay, thank you. So the last question will be for Augusto, and then with this question we close the question and answer session. Augusto, do you believe that reading aloud for children at home brings benefits to reading development? Sorry, I'm translating online because the question was posed in Portuguese. Did you understand the question, Augusto?
Yes, that's fine. So the short answer is yes, and the reason the answer is yes is because reading to children helps develop knowledge of language sounds. And when you read, you usually use words that you wouldn't normally use, or sometimes you use words that you normally use on your day-to-day with children. If you interact with children and you establish that partnership between who's reading and the child, they develop positive attitudes towards reading. They develop alphabet knowledge. They learn to identify that the meaning is coming from print, and they become more familiar with print, and that print is the medium of the message. So even though teaching and sort of developing some skills that require something more direct activities like phonological awareness and alphabet knowledge are also important and need to be done directly, especially with kids whose parents don't read to them and who come from more underprivileged families. You have to, make up for lost time. Reading to children, yes, it is it will not teach them to read. This is important. We need to say this because learning to read, to decode, and then to comprehend will not come, just because someone is reading to you, but it will give you some of the skills and knowledge that you need to overcome this obstacle of finally learning to read and reading to learn. So yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much again, the three of you.
Can I add a comment?
Sure.
Sorry. Because I did, I did think about this. So one thing and again, I'm sort of being contrarian here. I mean, I think curricula are really good. I think it's important for kids to go to school. It obviously has an effect. But I do worry, and I think sort of piggybacking on the idea of socioeconomic status, and if we considered it in the United States in light of the protests and discussion, in the US and across the world now with the protests, there's a really strong discussion of to what extent does the educational system really adapt itself to the realities of children from different backgrounds, right? We'll just use the word backgrounds. So for example, there's pretty strong, there's a movie called Race to Nowhere. It's a movie about, this sort of really push to have kids study a lot, and sort of based on the idea of sort of upper middle class kids that are studying, 14, 15 hours a day. That turns out somebody's neighbor commits suicide at 13 because she was a straight A student. And so there's a whole question of like, are we pushing our kids too hard, right? It's a different opposite finding from the socioeconomics, lower socioeconomic status. Do they not have enough? But in that movie, there's a sort of discussion. There's a teacher in an inner city school who decides to have people in the school write about their life experiences, right? So they do this sort of writing about what's happening in their lives. And she says, this is language about their lives. She ends up quitting her job because the principal wants her to follow the curriculum, right? Which is set up by people who are not from the same socioeconomic status and have no idea of how they should achieve literacy. And one of my really sticking points is, you have to get kids engaged. And I worry a little bit when you have standardization of literacy practices from people that are not in these communities, that they don't really understand fundamentally how to get the kids to connect. Another example is a teacher in El Paso, Texas, who it's on a border, and she says they would have like these passages on lofts, right? So these sort of fancy apartments now that exist. I'm not sure if, Brazilians, I mean, there must be a word, maybe they use lofts. I know there's a lot of borrowing. And so they would have a passage on lofts and they're like, well, we've never seen a loft. Like, what is a loft? And they had to read about this. So I do worry a little bit about the connection between, I think school is great, but I think school needs to be brought to the people. And Paulo Freire, probably more than anybody, would argue very strongly, right, that schooling is a way of imposing a social and a socioeconomic oppressive status, if I want to use that word. And that really bothers me because I think we can do better. We need to reach kids. We need to reach them in the way that they can be reached and not in the way that some person like me who doesn't live in their neighborhood thinks they need to be reached. And so anyway, that was my comment. I'll stop there.
Mailce, I know we're at the end of it, but may I make a one or two sentences? And obviously, Arturo, you are right. And I mean, I think you make a wise point that the way in which we approach education is often leaving significant numbers of kids behind because of a lack of connection to culture and meaning. And I think that's a very good point. And I think that's got to be our priority. So I say amen to everything, with one minor caveat, which is however you shape the education environment to be engaging and culturally respectful, there may be mechanisms or elements of what becoming literate demands that are in fact invariant. And I think so the ability to marry the invariant into the culturally respectful instruction and therefore serve your important argument, but also the need to teach reading right. Reading, the way in which the mechanisms of learning to read need to reorganize the brain are really not so different, in my view, at least. And so these are our views. And I think the evidence suggests that. So really how we deliver versus what we deliver is where I would totally agree with you. But I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater of the importance of gaining this fluent literacy skills. So it's just not a disagreement, just a kind of a nuance on that.
But so it's kind of like a content argument. We could have the same processes, but change the content.
Exactly.
Context and content.
Context matters. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, so thank you so much for this delightful discussion, for the excellent talks. This is a really, really great opportunity for us to see the three of you together. Many compliments here on the chat. And I'm gonna ask you for your final words to the audience. And perhaps you can start with Ken or Arturo or
Okay. First of all, I want to thank all of you for, I thank the organizers for the invitation, and I thank all of you for your listening and your involvement. And I just want to tell you that stay safe and be well and be loving at this difficult time. I know how challenging it is, not just in the Northern Hemisphere, but now in the Southern Hemisphere. And my thoughts and prayers are with everybody.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, yes, of course, it's a very difficult time. So, you know, we could go on and on about that. And I echo Ken's points. I mean, absolutely. I hope everybody's safe. Please try your best to do what's sane at this time. And I do want to end with one point, which is that for the longest time, people who study literacy, right, such as Ken or Augusto, would approach me and I would always ask, why aren't they talking about language? Why are they so fixated on, what's the big deal about literacy? And there were two things that changed my mind, that literacy would be something that made, you know, that at least I would be a consumer of, if not a producer of. And one was that I learned German, and I found that when I learned German, reading was just a salvation. It is hard, but actually reading is a way for me to get really good German. So someone's speaking German, if I can read it, and it's transparent, so not too bad. I may not understand everything I read, but I'm getting really good German in my head. Someone's speaking in my head in really, really high good language. And so that's actually really beneficial. I never saw it until I actually started reading this language. I'm like, whoa, there's this huge benefit that I've been taking for granted. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is one that always comes back to me, is some studies, and again, we can talk about this offline, have suggested that there may be a difference in the use of morphosyntax, particularly in Romance languages, and its influence on reading. I always worry a little bit about the Anglo-based view of reading. I take it that they're very similar systems that's so vocabulary and so sort of unique to English, and sort of, you know, what about the role of morphosyntax? What about all these other cross-linguistic differences? Like, what kind of role do they play? Maybe not at the level of brain, but what kinds of roles do they play? And I always have that question hanging around. But again, those are sort of my parting thoughts. I think literacy, I finally come around to literacy. I'm still a language person, but it was great to hear from you guys and hear about all these and the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. It was a pleasure to hear you. And we finally got to meet you. Yeah. Augusto?
Well, Mailce and Abalin, thank you for organizing this. It is a pleasure to be, together with Ken and Arturo. And I would like to underscore what Arturo says, the relevance of context and understanding where kids come from is not independent of the fact that we have to focus on these skills. I think that I wouldn't want my message to be mistaken for We know everything that needs to be done, but what we're trying to say is some of these basic skills are lacking, and they have to be taught in the best way that they can be taught to these kids. And what you mentioned in terms of context also happens in terms of the presumption of skills that need to be learned to kids from different backgrounds, and the idea that well, they're going to learn at some point, we don't need to teach these basic skills is also harmful and mistaken, because it starts from an assumption that these skills emerge naturally, and they do not. And kids whose parents don't have time to read to them, or actually a lot of them actually don't know how to read. In some programs in Brazil, they're starting to give out books with stories, in pictures and not words, so parents can, try to do some reading together with the kids, at least telling stories. And the context is extremely important. Brazil is a continental country. We cannot presume to know, the particular context that every kid needs to want to learn to read in the North, Northeast, and South, by talking in our academic air-conditioned rooms. But the skills have to be, emphasized in the sense that we cannot presume that these kids will get access to them, because they usually do not. Right? But thank you, Arturo. And I hope that clarifies that I wasn't at any point arguing that context does not matter. And
I never took it that way.
Okay, yeah. So literacy is a very important issue in Brazil, in our educational system. There were talks, lectures, and panel sessions about this before ours in this online event, and there will be others. The very last lecture of this sequence of presentations on the 30th of July, I think, will be given by Professor Magda Soares, who is perhaps the most important, or one of the most important researchers in the area of literacy in Brazil. So the topic will come up in other sessions and lectures, especially because of its importance in our context. I'd like to thank the audience for staying with us. Please keep supporting Abralin Ao Vivo Linguists Online, and thank you very much for your participation.